Our next speaker today is Mr. Fredtaylor. He's actually a lawyer, and he has defended some of the monuments that are being assaulted. So as we welcome him to come on forward, he'll be talking probably a little bit about that, and I think he's also going to be talking about Robert E. Lee, the husband, as a husband and also as a father. So he's coming right now, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How is everybody? Happy Lee Jackson Day. All right. Well, I was going to tell you, sort of by introduction, on the way up here today, I just got up here a few minutes ago. I hail from the Tidewater area. I know see a few friendly faces from home. But on the way up here, I tuned into the House of Delegates, which just came into session this week, Virginia General Assembly, and I don't know if this got brought up before, so if I'm repeating anything from Mr. Toombs, hopefully you'll bear with me since I missed part of his comments. Parts I did were fantastic though. But on the way up here, I was listening to the Virginia General Assembly, and one of the reasons I did that was I was kind of curious or not whether anything would get said about this being a state holiday. And I'm very happy to report that briefly after the House went into session, the delegate from right here, Rockbridge County, Lexington community, Delegate Ben Klein, rose and was recognized by the Speaker of the House. And he then went into about a 3 to maybe 4 minute speech about the greatness of Robert E. Lee and the greatness of honoring those two men and the importance of this state holiday. And he said something, and I actually stopped my vehicle to write this down because I wanted to make sure I got it right. He brought up the fact that people have been looking and researching and talking about the lives of Lee and Jackson so much more since the incidents in Charlottesville this past year. And he said this, I quote, "Times may change, but greatness does not." Amen. Times may change, but greatness does not. And I could think of no better way to start talking about my topic today, which was Robert E. Lee as a father, as a family man, as a husband, than to remind us, regardless of what lens you view it, 1861 lens or the 1865 lens or the lens of the 21st century, greatness does not change. And I think we would all agree that Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were two great men. So with that, I'll start talking about the topic that I'm prepared this afternoon, and that is Lee as a father. This topic kind of came to me because of everything, again, that has gone on in the past year with the cry for monuments to be removed or tore down. And oftentimes what I heard, even from those who are pro-Southern, I heard a lot about Lee as the military man that we should honor. The man who was superintendent at West Point, who guided our future military leaders that he both served with and fought against in 1861 to 1865. Lee as the person, the military genius during the war. Lee as the educator here at Washington College. And it got me thinking, well, those are all, in many ways, professional attributes. He was, in fact, an educator. He was, in fact, a military genius. But he was also a husband for many, many years. He was also a father of a number of children. And that got me on a quest to study that topic a little bit more, the personal side of Robert E. Lee, the human side of Robert E. Lee. And the first thing that kind of came to my mind was a little bit of history. I have to admit, I did not know much about Lee's family. I mean, I certainly knew the names. I knew, particularly as it relates to the war itself, Custis Lee rose to Major General. Rooney Lee rose to Major General. Those are the ones that I sort of knew of. I knew vaguely of Robert E. Lee Jr. and his service up here, but I certainly didn't know much about the rest of the family. And I recalled a lot of my family's hails from down in North Carolina. I don't know if we got any Tar Heels here with us today. There we go, got a few here. But my family comes from what's basically the Warren and Halifax County in North Carolina area, which is almost, if you were to kind of draw a line, maybe a little due south of here, just across the line, everybody knows today is the Lake Gaston area of North Carolina. And it was there in Warren County in 1862 that several, in fact, of Robert E. Lee's children was residing in the middle of the war. And one in particular that I knew a little bit about, and is where I began my research, was Annie Carter Lee. Annie Carter Lee was Robert E. Lee and Mary Lee's fourth child, their second oldest daughter. And of course, when war came in 1861, as we all know, the Lees were forced to abandon Arlington House. The war was literally right across the river from them, and so Arlington was no longer safe. And so out of an abundance of caution, Lee sent his daughters, and at one point Mary went down with them, but Lee sent his daughters down to North Carolina for a couple reasons. They had family friends down there, but there was also, the particular place they were at was the Jones Farm. There was a spring there, a mineral spring, and he hoped that it would improve their health, but also keep them out of harm's way, keep them safe. This occurred late in 1861, 1862, while they stayed down in Carolina. And unfortunately, in the fall of 1862, young Annie Carter Lee contracted typhoid fever, and it killed her. October 20th, 1862. She was 23 years of age. And I knew that she had passed away down there because, like I said, I got family down there. I had seen the grave site for a number of years. And it kind of got me thinking. I said, this is one of those things that we take for granted. What is the effect of losing a child? And in many ways, you can do nothing about it. I've got two boys of my own. Thankfully, I've never lost a child. I think there's kind of an old saying about you never hope, as a parent, you never hope to see a child go before you do. But I started studying from that point because I wanted to see what I could find, how Lee dealt with that, how he addressed that issue of having to be out in the field on a campaign and know that his family may be in harm's way. And not just from the war itself, but from the realities of daily life, and in this case, something like typhoid. And I found this letter that Lee wrote to his wife, Mary. And I think this is really kind of where the stage is set, and where we start talking about who is Robert E. Lee as the person, as the father, as the husband. He wrote to her, this is shortly a couple weeks after he's found out that young Annie has passed away. I cannot express the anguish I feel at the death of our sweet Annie. To know that I shall never see her again on earth, that her place in our circle, which I always hoped one day to again enjoy, is forever vacant, is agonizing in the extreme. But God in this, as in all things, has mingled mercy with the blow, in selecting the one best prepared to leave us. Mary, may you be able to join me in saying, His will be done. I know how much you will grieve and how much she will be mourned. I wish I could give you any comfort, but beyond our hope in the great mercy of God and the belief that He takes her at the same time and place when it is best for her to go, there is none. May that same mercy be extended to us all, and may we be prepared for His summons. And that certainly struck me because, and I'm sure in many ways he was trying to accomplish a couple things. Number one, he was trying to console a grieving mother and wife. But you see a little glimpse of Lee and the effect that this probably had on him when he talks about that anguish, when he talks about longing for them all to be together again in better days, brighter times. And yet, despite that pain, despite that sorrow, I think he reminds his wife, I think he reminds himself of faith in the Almighty. And that's something that we see, I think we all know, we recognize, it's well known, Lee's devotion to God and Christianity. But I think this is a much more personal one when you lose a child like that. Now, we'll talk a little bit about something a little more positive about Lee as a father, kind of moving on. One of the things you got to think about, again, I think we take it for granted, Lee was a lifetime military man. And that put him kind of unlike, in some ways like today. Today, we know of husbands and fathers and spouses and mothers who go off to serve and they have kind of a tour of duty and they come back. And obviously the strains of family life are upon those families when that person is gone and traveling, particularly if they're overseas. That certainly occurred in the time period that Robert E. Lee was coming up. It was much different because it wasn't just, oh, you were getting deployed for 6 months. These were periods of time where he probably did not see his family for years at the time, particularly during the Mexican War period when he was literally across the country in the midst of war and turmoil. And I found it very striking as I studied Lee's early life and the fact he's got young kids. He's got a wife at home who's raising these young kids. Lee, on a daily, if not weekly basis, was writing to every member of his family. He was writing to his wife, writing personal things to her. He was writing to the children as if they were there with him or vice versa, talking about their daily lives. In the 1850s, Rob Jr. wrote that he remembered that his father, even in his mid-40s, was active. He was strong. He was, the person that a young boy looked up to. He said, I never remember my father being sick or ill. And in many ways we look at Lee as almost immortal, but hearing it from a son, a one who probably did see the faults and the strains within the family, this is someone who remembers his father as always strong and always putting that appearance to the family that we would want in a leader. Robert E. Lee Jr. wrote, I presume he was certainly indisposed at times, but no impressions of that kind remain upon me. When he was with us children, he was always bright and attentive to the little folk, romping, playing, and joking with us. With the older children, he was just as companionable, and I have seen him join my elder brothers and their friends. Get to the next page here so I can tell you this straight. When they would try their powers at a high jump or some other exercise in our yard. The two younger children he would pet a great deal, and our greatest treat was to surprise him in the morning when he was home, listening while he talked to us in his bright, entertaining way. This custom we kept up until I was almost 10 years old and older. Although he was joyous and familiar to us as a father, he was very firm and proper on all other occasions. Never indulged us in anything that was not good for us, and exacted the most implicit obedience. And I kind of noted here, this is kind of one of those circumstances of there's a time and a place for everything. And I kind of picture Lee there, certainly with his kids and with his family when those opportunities arose, when he was not off to West Point or he was not off on some campaign somewhere, taking advantage of not having to be the leader, not having to be the military man, but being able to be the husband and father that crawled in the floor and played with his kids and spent time with them, while at the same time, and Robert E. Lee Jr. noted this, at the same time exacting the most implicit obedience. That is the Lee as a person that we often forget. Later on, Robert E. Lee Jr., some of you probably know this story better than I do. Robert E. Lee Jr. was one of the kids who did not quite go the same direction that the other brothers, Custis and Rooney, did, kind of when the war broke out. Robert E. Lee Jr. enlisted as a private, despite the fact that his father took a very major role in Virginia's Confederate forces in 1861. But Robert E. Lee Jr. wanted to do it the right way. He wanted to work up through the ranks if it was so determined by his own merit. And he noted during the war of having frequent opportunities of getting to see his father as the course of the war went on. And later on, Robert E. Lee Jr. did earn his own way. He rose from a private to a captain in the Rockbridge Artillery and later as a staff officer. And once he became a staff officer in the middle of the war, he had more frequent opportunities to see his father. And he recalled years later that every time he visited his father would take him into his tent. And they would talk about his mother, Lee's wife, and they would talk about their siblings and how they were doing. And he was always concerned about not only the family itself, but Lee wanted to know the news of where Robert E. Lee Jr. had come from. How were the people in the neighborhood? How were the people in that community surviving during the midst of the war? And as any son might do, whether he's coming back from college on a break to see his parents, he remembered with fondness that his father would always offer him a meal and make sure that he was well fed before he went on to continue his mission or return back to camp. And I think again we see that care and compassion. Despite the fact that we know Lee had many other duties facing him as he went through reports and paperwork and dealt with the day-to-day life of being commander of a force as the Army of Northern Virginia and later commander-in-chief of all, or general-in-chief of all the forces, we see the father who still made sure that his son was taken care of, just like he would have. Again, what came to my mind was, the kid who comes home in December with the load of laundry and an empty pantry. Robert E. Lee wanted to make sure his son was taken care of. That compassion extended to the other children as well. Rooney, who is a nickname obviously, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, not to be confused with their cousin Fitzhugh Lee. Rooney Lee, cavalry commander during the war, is wounded in 1863 at the Battle of Brandy Station. At this point, Rooney is the only one of Robert E. Lee's children who are married. And Lee finds out about this. He hears that his son has been wounded in battle, and the first thing he does is writes to Rooney's wife. Her name was Charlotte. And he writes to her, "I am so grieved, my dear daughter." I think it's important he doesn't look at her as a daughter-in-law, but he looks at her as a member of the family. "My dear daughter, I am so grieved to send to you Rooney wounded, but I am so grateful that his wound is of a character to give us full hope of a speedy recovery. With his youth and strength to aid him and your tender care to nurse him, I trust he will soon be well again. I know that you will unite with me in thanks to Almighty, who has so often sheltered him in the hour of danger for his recent deliverance, and lift up your whole heart in praise to him for sparing a life so dear to both of us, while enabling him to do his duty in the station in which he had placed him." Rooney, for those of you who may know this story, was sent basically back to his wife Charlotte at a plantation outside of Richmond in the summer of 1863. At the same time, Lee is moving into Maryland and on into Pennsylvania in what becomes the Gettysburg campaign. While that was going on, an independent group of Union cavalry, learning that Rooney is recuperating just outside of Richmond, lead what is essentially a very daring mission to capture him. And they do. And this comes just 2 weeks after Rooney is wounded. Again, Robert E. Lee learns of, at this point, not only has his son been wounded, he learns of his son's capture under these crazy circumstances. Interestingly enough, and this says a lot about Rooney, Robert E. Lee Jr. was there in the house with him, and he wanted to stay there to tend to and take care of Rooney. And Rooney would not let him, and he sent him on his way. And Jr. escaped the Union cavalry that day while Rooney remained. So Robert E. Lee finds out about this, and he again writes to Charlotte, trying to alleviate some of her concern. He writes, "You must not be sick while he is away, or he will be more restless under his separation. Get strong and hearty by his return, that he may more the rejoice at the sight of you. I can appreciate your distress. I deeply sympathize with it. And in the lone hours of the night, I groan in sorrow at his captivity. But we must bear it. We must exercise all our patience and do nothing to aggravate the evil. This, besides injuring ourselves, would rejoice our enemies, and note, be sinful in the eyes of God. In his own good time, he will relieve us and make all things work together for our good, if we give him our love and place in him our trust. I can see no harm that will result from Rooney's capture except his detention. I feel assured that he will be well attended to. He will be in the hands of old army officers and surgeons, most of whom are men of principle and humanity. His wound, I understand, has not been injured by his capture, but he is doing well. Nothing would do him more harm than to learn that you were sick and sad. How could he get well? So cheer up and prove, he didn't say provide, cheer up and prove your fortitude and your patriotism. You may think of him and love him as much as you please, but do not grieve over him or grow sad." And what had been occurring, Charlotte herself had been ill during this time period. That had been much aggravated by, first, Rooney's wounding, and he's coming home, she's having to tend to him, and then second, he gets captured. She essentially has a break because the stresses are getting to her. She has a husband in the field, she has no other family that she can rely upon, and I think in many ways this is why this letter from her father-in-law, Robert E. Lee, is as honest and very blunt. I mean, you know, these are very direct and personal conversations we see from Lee to his daughter-in-law regarding what his expectations of her are, not just as a mother, but also as a daughter, if you will, a member of this family, but also as he brings it up, to do her duty and to be a patriot as well, to see to it that no harm comes because of these circumstances. Lee was very much devoted to Charlotte. As I mentioned before, this was his only daughter-in-law at the time. And his love for her was like that of his own children. She can't overcome this, though. And a few weeks after Rooney is captured, she herself is literally knocking on death's door. She is taken to downtown Richmond to be cared for. She becomes very ill. Custis, knowing the situation, Custis at this time, who's the eldest of the Lee boys, is also in Richmond. He's serving on the staff of, basically as a military advisor for President Davis. Custis obviously knows about his brother. His brother at this point has been taken to Fort Monroe under the watchful eyes of Benjamin Beast Butler. Charlotte is in Richmond. They have, the family has tried to provide whatever medical care they can for Charlotte during her illness. Custis is there in Richmond as well. So he is trying to kind of step in, as he knows the expectation from his brother would be, to see that Charlotte is cared for. And he says, he realizes that death is imminent for Charlotte. And so Custis, being the same rank as Rooney, both of them at this point were generals in the Army. In fact, both were brigadier generals at this point in 1863. Custis writes to Butler at Fort Monroe and explains the situation and says, you know, obviously you have my brother, his wife, his young wife, who he's only been married to for a few years, is in Richmond. She is dying. I will take my brother's place. Allow me to be your captive under a flag of truce so that my brother can come up here and pay his final respects to his wife. And unfortunately, as if we didn't need any other reason to hate Benjamin Butler, he very promptly refuses that request. And just a few days later, Charlotte passes away while Rooney is a captive at Fort Monroe. And again, this struck the family. Maybe not as much as the loss of Annie Carter Lee, but Charlotte was just as much a part of that Lee family as the rest of them. And we again see how the effect that has upon not just Robert E. Lee, but Mary and the siblings to lose a family member. You know, it's one thing to be out there, and I think it's very easy, especially from a soldier's point of view. You see death, especially during 1861 to 1865, you see death every day. It's a lot different when it's personal, when it's family. And in this case, it's not on the battlefield necessarily. It's at home. And again, you know, we all have our own family stories. The war affected everybody, whether you were on the battlefield or on a campaign, or whether you were at home. Everyone played a role in the war, and it affected every family differently. We don't often think about how it affected people like Robert E. Lee. And again, I think this gives us a glimpse into his life, particularly during the war. One thing, though, that always did brighten Lee up, and that was a love of children, and not just his own children. Lee, in many ways, all of the records indicate, not just from his children, but from other accounts, Lee's eyes would brighten. A smile would come upon his face when he saw kids. Probably in many ways it was the youthfulness of kids. I think often we today, you have kids in the room, you know, the carefree attitude, the spirit and the energy of children can awaken people. And even on the worst of days, children made Robert E. Lee happy. There's an account, January of 1865, and you think about it, January of 1865, just, you know, a month before Fort Fisher falls, several months before the Appomattox campaign and the ultimate surrender. Lee is hunkered down in Richmond and Petersburg. And these young girls somehow kind of make their way through the lines and show up at Robert E. Lee's tent. And of course his staff officers are, you know, kind of their duty is to make sure people don't get to Lee. Well, they also knew that having some young children of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old come see the general might be a good thing. And so they allow it to happen. And Lee wrote to Mary about this event and talked about these young girls who had shown up with some fresh eggs from their farm, with a block of soap that they had made, with some vegetables that had been grown in their garden. And Lee told Mary that he had not had such a pleasant visit for a long time, and that despite what his own cook had wished him to do, he had actually sent the young ladies back home with the very goods that they had brought and encouraged them to use those items themselves or to share it with the other people in their neighborhood, and that the only thing that he required of them was their laughter and kisses. That is the Robert E. Lee that we picture, kind of in the floor playing with the kids. The Robert E. Lee who steps away from, the stress of the battlefield to be human. Something we often don't think about with Lee. He is human. That is the type of thing that he's writing to his wife to tell her about. Not what's going on in a particular campaign, but the things that will not only bring a smile to his face, but that probably brought a smile to Mary's face as well. His love of children continued. The stories are not just during the war, whether it's kids coming to him and, giving him flowers or hugs, in the various towns that the Army of Northern Virginia marched through. But there's a great story here in Lexington itself about Lee when he served as president of Washington College. All of the children in this, and I'm sure some of you know this story. In fact, some of you are probably bigger experts on Lee. I'm certainly a student of Lee, not an expert by any means. All of the children in this community loved Robert E. Lee, and they were devoted to him. And it is said that even much kind of to their parents' chagrin sometimes, they felt no hesitation in going up to Lee because of how warm he was to them and how he always interacted to them. And frequently, he would meet children on the street as he took a stroll, or he rode Traveler through Lexington. And he would grab one of the children up and take them for a ride through town. And what kid doesn't like a horseback ride? Even in those days, that was something fun, and particularly with the man that they idolized. Well, at this point, in fact, it was one of Robert E. Lee's godchildren. We all know who John Letcher is, governor of Virginia. Well, during the war, Letcher and his wife gave birth to a daughter. She ended up being named Virginia, very, very great name, Virginia Lee Letcher, known as Jenny. And after the war, she had a younger sister born, Fanny, and the point that Lee is president of Washington College, the Letchers are up here in Lexington. And so Jenny and Fanny frequently got to see their godfather, Robert E. Lee. Well, on one particular day, Jenny had been out playing, and like most young, little siblings, the younger one, Fanny, had been following Jenny around and just worrying her to death. And Jenny is the big sister. She has, continued to tell the little one, go home, leave me alone, quit bothering me, you're not old enough to be out here playing with us big kids. And she's probably, 8 years old at this point. And Jenny is just frustrated, as you might imagine, and she finally just, throws her hands up in the air and starts pouting and sits down on the curb. When who comes riding by? But the president, General Lee, and he looks and sees his goddaughter down there and wants to know what is going on. And Jenny is excited because there he is, her buddy. And she says, General, please get Fanny, tell Fanny to go home. Maybe she'll listen to you. And so what does Lee do? He grabs Fanny up, much to Fanny's delight, and he takes her for a ride on Traveler and ultimately takes her back to the Letcher home. And so Jenny stayed and played and did her thing, and she returns home later that evening. And needless to say, who is awaiting her but her mother, who is very much concerned that she has bothered the good general and, troubled on him to have to look after Fanny when it in fact was Jenny's responsibility to look after her little sister. And Mrs. Letcher, inquired of her, why did you give General Lee so much trouble? To which Jenny very honestly replied, I could not make Fanny go home, and I thought he could do anything. And so that's the general that we know, the general that could do anything, the general that had the love of family, had the love of children. As I've done this program, I've done it a couple times now, people have often asked me, you know, what's the sources of your research? How did you kind of come to this? You know, I'm not a sociologist. It's up to you to glean from these stories and to make determinations of, you know, what characteristics make up a particular person. But I do have a few favorites that have struck me that I think we all can learn from. Some of these are fairly well known as far as quotes go from Lee, others not so much. The first was found in a letter to his son. This was to Custis, I believe while Custis was at West Point, so 1850s. And he wrote to Custis and said, "You must study hard, you must gain knowledge, and learn your duty to God and your neighbor. That is the great object of life." And when I first read through that, I thought, wow, that's nice. And I went back and I looked at it again, and there was something that sort of particularly grabbed me. You must study hard, gain knowledge. Obviously, that's educate yourself. I think he's talking about book learning. You know, learn, study, work hard. In this case, his son's at West Point. But the second part to that, he doesn't say do your duty to God and your neighbor. He says learn your duty to God and your neighbor. I think that's a trait that only experience and time can bring to someone. And that's what I thought was kind of interesting with this. Especially a father telling a young teenage son that, you know, it's going to take time. You know, you study, you work hard, you do your academics, but you also, it's not an easy path. You must learn the right path. And that comes through hard work and time and making mistakes, as we all know, you know, through life, to truly succeed. And in this case, he says that's the great object of life. Learning that duty to God, learning that duty to one's neighbor. To his daughters, and this is from a letter that he wrote after the war. Agnes, I believe, had gone up to Baltimore to stay for a pretty considerable period of time. And to her, he wrote, it's kind of interesting, especially in our 21st century glasses, "Do not go to many parties. Preserve your simple tastes and manners, and you will enjoy more pleasure. Plainness and simplicity of dress, early hours, and rational amusements, I wish you to practice." And I think there he's talking about don't indulge. You know, keep things simple. You know, remember your manners, remember respect, remember the simple things. And the last of kind of the key quotes I think that I've gleaned out of reading some of these letters of Lee is one that he wrote to Rob. Rob, I got to tell you, you know, of all of Lee's children, I think Rob is kind of, in some ways, my favorite. But at the same time, I think he is the one that is probably the most like Lee. He took a different path, but Rob, I think, from a humility standpoint, is the most like his father. Rob never was much for kind of the glitz and the glory. I think that's why he enlisted as a private in 1861. And when the war ended, and his brothers, Custis and Rooney, were, you know, they were former Confederate generals at this point and went on to political careers and other things, what did Rob do? He found him a farm out on the northern neck of Virginia. And Robert E. Lee was just as proud of his farmer son as he was you know, his sons that would go on for bigger and better, you know, becoming politicians. And to Rob, he wrote, "A farmer's motto should be toil and trust." Toil and trust. I think this is a lot like that original quote that I gave you to Custis at West Point. You must toil. You must work hard. You must study hard and gain knowledge. I think that's kind of a key to farming, whether it's in 1866 or whether it's in 2018. You got to work hard as a farmer. You got to get out there and you got to, you know, we say you reap what you sow. Sowing is very difficult. And to Rob, I think he was trying to instill on the fact you just can't do it halfway. You've got to be committed. And whether you're a farmer or whether you've got some other pursuit, I think that's something we can certainly learn from. But from that toiling, from that hard work, regardless, you can work hard and have a bad result. And I think that's why Lee stressed kind of the two, maybe somehow differing components here. Toil and trust. Obviously, very clearly, he was talking about have a trust in the Almighty, have a trust that your hard work is going to pay off. But that trust is also trust that even if your hard work doesn't pay off, that that the Almighty is going to be there to take care of you, to get you to that next step. And I think that's something that certainly Lee instilled not only to his family, but those that he led along the way, whether it was at West Point or in the Confederate Army or here at what's now Washington and Lee University. In conclusion, I'll leave you with this and sort of kind of bring us full circle to where we started. I told you that in 1862, Annie Carter Lee passed away. Well, this was the midst of war. It was not like Lee could call a timeout and say, okay, well, I'm going to go make funeral arrangements for my daughter. His wife certainly wasn't in any shape to do that as well, because she was very sick during the war herself, and next to being basically an invalid after the war, to which Lee himself took care of her on a daily basis to make sure that she was properly cared for. And so in 1866, you know, the war is ended. Annie is buried in Warren County, North Carolina, not too far from the home in which she stayed. In 1866, the people of Warren County, North Carolina, write to Lee, and they tell him, you know, we have been the caretakers of your daughter for the last 4 years. As the war commenced, we were unable to properly pay respects to her. We were unable to put a monument or a tombstone up for her, but we want to do something now. And our local community has raised funds to see that Annie is properly honored. And he invites Lee and the Lee family, Custis and Rooney and the daughters, to come to Warren County to make kind of a formal tribute to Annie Carter Lee. Unfortunately, at this time, as I mentioned before, Lee is caring for Mary. And she is very sick. He is tending to her. And Lee writes back to the people of Warren County and says, I have always cherished the intention of visiting the tomb of her who never gave me aught but pleasure. Though absent in person, my heart will be with you, and my sorrow and devotions will be mingled with yours. The good side of this is that some of the other family members were able to attend, and they had just a beautiful ceremony in Annie's honor in 1866. But it always troubled Lee that he had not been able to visit the grave of his daughter. And so, in the spring of 1870, Lee himself was facing very severe medical concerns. And his doctor told him, you need to get out of Lexington. You need to get out of the valley. You need to go to a warmer climate and get some fresh air, or at least some different air, and take care of yourself, or you're not going to be here much longer. And so, with his other daughter, Agnes, by his side, he decides, I've got kind of two things. I kind of look at this in modern terms as kind of those bucket list items that you want to accomplish before something happens to you. He said, I got two things I want to do. He said, I will go get some fresh air. I'll head to the deep south in a warmer climate. He said, but one of the things that I want to do is I want to go and visit Annie's grave. And so Lee begins his southern tour in the spring of 1870. And in March of 1870, he visits the grave of his daughter, Annie Carter Lee, for both the first and the last time. There is no period account or otherwise of what occurred or anything that was said or done other than kind of his visit to the local community. But you can only imagine how sorrowful it probably was for Lee to be there that day. He then continued his journey southward, and he went to visit one more grave. And that was a grave outside, actually on the islands on the Georgia coast, outside of Savannah. Anybody know whose grave that was that he wanted to go visit? Frank knows. I heard it. It's his father's grave. Because in addition to never having had the opportunity to visit the grave of his daughter, he also had never had, that I can find, even when he was stationed down there at the beginning of the war, had never have had the opportunity to visit the grave of his father, Light Horse Harry Lee. Light Horse Harry Lee died in 1818. He actually himself had been convalescing down on the Georgia coast because he had been in bad health. He was in his early 60s at this point. And Light Horse Harry Lee passes away at a plantation off of those barrier islands and is buried there in 1818. Robert E. Lee is 11 years old at that time when his father passes away. And so Robert E. Lee gets this opportunity to pay a final tribute to his father in the spring of 1870. And then he returns home. And you're probably doing the math because it's just a few 6 months later after Lee's return here to Lexington that he himself passes away. In hindsight, and I've told people as I've done this program, I've never found a good positive way to end this program, other than to leave you with the fact that even in his little dying months, the people and the things that he was thinking about the most was his family. We all know that after the war, one of the things that Lee wanted to do was write something official to tell about his time during 1861 to 1865. As his health deteriorated, he realized that he probably was not going to be able to accomplish that, certainly as time passed on. And the things that he held dear, as much as I know he loved every one of those soldiers that served with him, as much as all of the stories that I know you all have heard time and time again about soldiers stopping him in the street and coming to visit him and him taking time for them regardless of the circumstance. As much as he loved that time and his service to both the United States and the Confederate States, because it was Union soldiers and officers visiting him too after the war. The thing that he held the most dear to him was his family. And if I can leave you with nothing else, it is, if you want to take hold of a characteristic of Robert E. Lee to live by, it is a devotion to family. And so as you travel around Lexington this weekend, as you visit the sites that Lee did, as you visit the places that Robert E. Lee visited, I ask you to remember that. You remember Lee as a husband, Lee as a father, and Lee as a son. Thank you.